Welcome, brave listeners. Tonight, I invite you to step into the darkness, to let the unknown whisper in your ear. These are not just stories. They are echoes of something deeper, something that lingers just beyond the veil of reality. Keep the lights low, the volume high, and whatever you do, don't look behind you. Now let's begin. Rain pattered steadily against the window, each droplet merging into a slow trickle down the glass. The dim glow of my desk lamp flickered against the stacks of notes, research papers, and half-empty coffee cups surrounding me. My fingers hovered over my journal, the words forming in my mind before I wrote them down. How long can the human mind last without sleep? I underlined the sentence twice, tapping the pen against the paper. My name is Ethan Graves. I'm 28, a freelance journalist, and for the last 6 months, I've suffered from relentless insomnia. No matter how exhausted I feel, no matter how many sleep aids I take, I can never seem to get more than an hour or two of restless, fractured sleep. The doctors call it chronic onset insomnia, a fancy term for saying my brain refuses to shut off when it's supposed to. Most people, when faced with a problem, look for solutions. I chose to take a different approach. I wanted to understand sleep deprivation, what it truly did to the human body and mind. The psychological toll, the physical decay, the way perception begins to warp. There were plenty of studies, sure, but none of them felt personal. None of them put the experience into words that people could really feel. So I decided to document it myself. The rules were simple: no sleep for 7 days. I'd record my symptoms, thoughts, and experiences in real time. I set up a camera to capture footage of myself. This wasn't just some reckless challenge. I wanted to see how far I could go before my mind began to betray me. I was eager, maybe even excited. The first 2 days were uneventful. I felt a dull fatigue creeping at the edges of my consciousness, but it was manageable. Coffee helped. Adrenaline kept me alert. A minor headache kicked in around the 30-hour mark, but it was nothing I hadn't dealt with before. My research suggested that at 72 hours, hallucinations could begin. Strange flickers in the corner of your vision, a creeping sense of paranoia, auditory distortions. The idea of my own mind playing tricks on me was both thrilling and terrifying. But I wasn't even past 48 hours when things started to feel off. It began with a power outage. I had been reviewing my notes when the lamp beside me suddenly went dark. The hum of my refrigerator cut off, leaving the apartment in an eerie silence. I checked my phone, 2:33 a.m. I frowned. There had been no storm warnings, no signs of grid failures. Just silence. My cat, Luna, who had been curled up near my feet, suddenly jerked awake. Her back arched for bristling. She let out a low, guttural hiss, staring intently at the far corner of the room. I followed her gaze. Nothing. Just the same empty corner. A pile of books stacked beside the window, my jacket hanging on the back of my chair. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing there, watching. The lights flickered back on a few moments later, and Luna bolted from the room. My pulse had quickened, but I forced a chuckle. Sleep deprivation could mess with your nerves. Maybe my mind was already playing its first trick on me. I jotted down a note in my journal. Unexplained power outage. Cat reacted strangely. Slight unease. Could be paranoia setting in early. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my temples. It was only the beginning. I could feel my body breaking down. By the time I crossed the 72-hour mark, everything felt distant, like I was moving through a thick, invisible fog. My head pounded relentlessly, a dull ache settling behind my eyes. My vision blurred at random intervals, forcing me to blink hard just to focus. My hands trembled when I tried to type, the words on my screen swimming before me. My journal entries reflected my state of mind, sentences trailing off mid-thought, letters occasionally missing. My handwriting, usually neat and precise, had become erratic, jagged. Head hurts. Hard to focus. Forgot what I was writing mid-sentence. Weird. I forced myself to keep going. This was expected, documented. Everything I was experiencing had been reported by sleep studies. But then, things started to deviate. It happened first in the bathroom. I had splashed cold water on my face, hoping to shock my senses back to clarity. As I lifted my head, I caught my reflection in the mirror, just a fraction of a second too late. I blinked. My reflection blinked a heartbeat after me. I leaned in closer, breath shallow, studying the face staring back. Same tired eyes, same unshaven jaw, but there was something off. Something in the way it held its expression a little too long before matching mine again. I swallowed hard and backed away, forcing a weak chuckle. All right, Ethan, your brain's just lagging. Classic sleep deprivation symptom. I wrote it down. Minor visual delay and reflection. Probably exhaustion. We'll monitor. That night, the sound distortions began. Lying on my couch, I tried to rest, not sleep, just let my body recharge. But the quiet of my apartment wasn't comforting anymore. The ticking clock on the wall seemed wrong. Sometimes too slow, each second dragging out painfully, stretching into an unnatural pause before the next tick. Other times, it sped up, the sharp clicks overlapping, racing ahead like it was trying to catch up. And then there were the whispers. At first, I thought they were coming from outside. Muted voices, muffled by walls, the kind you might hear from neighbors through thin apartment buildings. But the more I listened, the more I realized something was off. The whispers didn't have direction. They weren't coming from the ceiling, or the vents, or the apartment next door. They were just there, inside the space around me, inside the walls, inside my head. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. You're imagining things, I muttered. And maybe I was. Maybe that's why I swore I had closed my bedroom door before lying down, but now it was wide open. My stomach twisted. I stared at the darkened doorway, my pulse thudding against my ribs. Had I forgotten? I could have sworn, no. I knew I had shut it. I pushed myself up, legs shaky, and walked over. The hallway beyond was empty, just the faint glow of the bathroom nightlight casting soft shadows. I closed the door. This time, I locked it. Back at my desk, I tried to distract myself with research, but the shadows in the corners of my vision wouldn't stay still. Every time I glanced away, they shifted. Small, subtle movements, like something was there, just outside my line of sight. And the longer I ignored them, the more defined they became. I stopped looking in mirrors. It wasn't just the lag anymore. Every time I caught my reflection, something felt wrong. Like it was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. On the morning of day 5, I glanced at the bathroom mirror on accident. For a fraction of a second, my reflection didn't just lag, it smiled. I hadn't been smiling. I slammed the door shut so hard the walls rattled. Something was breaking inside my head. The time skip started that afternoon. I blinked, and suddenly, I was standing in the kitchen, the fridge door wide open. My mouth was dry, my body stiff, like I had been frozen in place for hours. I didn't remember getting up from my desk. I checked my phone. It was for 17 p.m. The last time I had checked, it had been 1:42. Almost 3 hours. Gone. That night, the shadows became real. It started with the feeling of being watched. A pressure in the room, thick and suffocating, making my skin prickle. The kind of feeling that sets every nerve on edge, like something unseen is hovering just over your shoulder. I refused to turn around. But then, in the dim light of my desk lamp, I saw it. A shape. In the corner of my room. Tall. Too tall. It didn't move. It didn't shift. It simply was. The air in my apartment had turned ice cold, my breath visible in thin, shivering wisps. The heater was on full blast. It didn't matter. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to be gone when I opened them. But it wasn't. And it was closer. By day 6, my journal had become nearly unreadable. My once carefully structured notes had unraveled into frantic, overlapping scrawls. Words scratched into the paper so hard the pages nearly tore. They are watching. They are closer. I can't sleep. I must not sleep. Don't look. Don't listen. Don't blink. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. That evening, Mark called. Mark had been my best friend since college. He knew about the experiment, but had mostly dismissed it as one of my weird journalist deep dives. Still, when I answered the video call, his face immediately twisted in concern. Jesus, Ethan, you look like hell. I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. Yeah, sleep deprivation will do that. He squinted at the screen, his face shifting slightly. Hey, are you alone? The question made my stomach turn. Of course I'm alone. Mark didn't answer right away. His eyes darted behind me. A cold dread slid through my veins. Ethan, his voice was barely above a whisper now. There's someone behind you. My body locked up. The air around me felt heavier, thicker, pressing down on my chest. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. "Don't," Mark started, but the call cut to static before I could hear the rest. The screen went black. I sat there, phone clutched in my trembling hands, afraid to turn around, afraid of what I might see. I woke up in the hallway, barefoot. The cold tile sent a sharp jolt through my body as I pushed myself up, my limbs sluggish, my skin clammy with sweat. My head throbbed with a dull, pulsing pain, like something was pressing against the inside of my skull, trying to get out. My apartment door was wide open. I stared at it, my breath uneven. I locked that door. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but there was none. The last thing I remembered was sitting at my desk, writing. After that, nothing. A blackout. A missing piece of time. I stepped forward, the hallway silent except for the distant hum of a refrigerator from another unit. The air smelled stale, as if it had been untouched for years. Inside, the apartment was dark. The heater had stopped working, and they were waiting. The shadows had shape now. They stood in the corners, by the walls, in the spaces where the light didn't reach. They weren't silhouettes anymore. There was depth to them. Something like limbs, something like faces, but wrong. Warped. I knew I was awake. This wasn't sleep paralysis. This wasn't a dream. Then they whispered my name. Soft. Close. Not from one place, but from everywhere. A chorus of voices, layering over each other like echoes from deep water. My name, stretched and distorted, slipping through the cracks of reality. Ethan. I turned sharply toward the bathroom, and my breath caught. The mirror. The reflection was darker than the room itself, as if it led somewhere else. And from its depths, a hand emerged. Long fingers, black as ink, reaching outward, stretching toward me. I staggered back, heart slamming against my ribs. Luna. She was crouched in the doorway, every muscle in her small body rigid, her fur bristling. Her pupils were blown wide, locked onto something just over my shoulder. I refused to turn around. I couldn't sleep. If I slept, they would take me. I could feel it. I curled up on the couch, knees to my chest, staring at the opposite wall. My journal lay open on the table, filled with page after page of frantic scrawls. I can't sleep. I must not sleep. They are here. They are waiting. The apartment wasn't right anymore. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in slow, unnatural waves. The ceiling warped, bending inward like something was pressing down from the other side. The whispering never stopped. And then, directly behind me, a voice. Calm, gentle. It's time. A cold breath against my ear. I squeezed my eyes shut. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know what was standing there. But I knew. I knew it was smiling. They found me 3 days later. I was curled up on the couch, unresponsive, my body trembling with fever. My journal lay open on the coffee table, pages torn, the ink smudged from frantic, uneven strokes. Luna was beside me, pressed against my leg, refusing to move. Mark was the one who called the paramedics. He hadn't heard from me since our last video call, and when I didn't answer my door, he convinced the building manager to unlock it. I don't remember any of this. I don't remember them shaking me, shouting my name, or how they managed to get me onto the stretcher. I only remember darkness. The doctor said I suffered from severe sleep deprivation, dehydration, and a complete psychological breakdown. They used terms like hallucinations, paranoia, self-induced psychosis. They told me the human brain wasn't meant to go that long without sleep, that I had pushed myself too far. They said the things I saw weren't real. But Mark knew better. He came to visit me in the hospital, but I wouldn't speak. Not at first. I just stared at the ceiling, listening to the steady beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor. It was comforting, repetitive. Unlike the unnatural ticking of my apartment clock, this sound didn't change. Mark sat beside me, silent for a long time. Then, finally, he pulled out his phone. "There's something you need to see," he said. He hesitated before pressing play. It was security footage from my apartment. The timestamp read 3:13 a.m., the same night they found me. At first, the video showed nothing unusual. My door was closed, the apartment still. Then, without warning, the door opened. Slowly, by itself. Mark swiped forward. The footage jumped ahead, showing the dimly lit room from the camera's angle near my desk. Something was moving. The shadows on the walls weren't behaving naturally. They stretched and twisted, bending in ways light shouldn't allow. And then, the final frame before the footage cut to black. A dark silhouette, standing over me as I slept. Mark swallowed hard and put his phone away. "I don't know what happened to you, man," he whispered. "But I don't think you were alone in there." I finally turned to look at him. My voice was hoarse when I spoke, barely above a breath. "They never left." Mark didn't ask what I meant. He didn't need to, because some things don't disappear just because you wake up. Some things wait, and they are still watching. I've always believed that sound has a soul. The way a voice carries through an empty hall, the way an instrument hums against old wood. There's something alive in that. That's why I never recorded in studios. Too clean, too perfect. Real music, the kind that makes your skin prickle, needs raw space to breathe. That's what brought me to Blackwood House. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, tucked away on the outskirts of town like a secret people didn't want to talk about. I'd heard rumors, stories of strange noises, flickering lights, the usual ghost nonsense, but I didn't care about any of that. What I cared about was its legendary acoustics, the way sound carried in its vast, open halls. A place like that could make an ordinary song feel like something otherworldly. And I needed that. I'd been stuck for years, hovering on the edge of success, just close enough to taste it, but never quite breaking through. If I could capture something special, something real, maybe this could be the album that changed everything. So, on a cold November afternoon, I packed up my gear, guitar, mic, portable recorder, and drove out to the house. Blackwood House loomed over the landscape like a corpse too stubborn to rot. The Victorian structure was massive, with steep gables and tall, arched windows, most of them boarded up. Vines snaked up the stone walls, gripping the house like skeletal fingers. The air smelled of damp wood and something stale, like the breath of a room that hadn't been opened in years. I forced the rusted front door open, and the hinges groaned in protest. Inside, dust motes swirled in the light streaming through cracks in the boarded windows. The ceilings were impossibly high, and everything, the grand staircase, the towering bookshelves, the massive fireplace, was draped in white sheets, frozen in time. The place had an odd stillness to it. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that felt expectant. I told myself it was just my imagination. I set up my equipment in the main hall. The ceiling stretched high above me, and the acoustics were exactly what I'd hoped for. I strummed my guitar, let the chords ring out. The sound hung in the air, rich and resonant. Perfect. I hit record. I played for nearly an hour, finger-picking soft melodies, humming, letting the space shape the music. My voice echoed back at me, fuller, deeper, like the house itself was singing along. It was exhilarating. When I finally stopped, I took off my headphones and exhaled. It felt good, like I had finally captured something real. I rewound the tape and hit play. My guitar, my voice, the reverb, rich and haunting. And then, a faint noise, almost too soft to notice. A static hiss. I frowned and adjusted the volume, leaning in. Underneath the music, buried deep in the recording, was something else. A whisper, just a breath. A syllable, maybe two. I told myself it was interference, a glitch, but my fingers trembled as I pressed rewind. I told myself it was nothing, just interference. Maybe a problem with the mic, or the way the sound bounced off the walls. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I recorded another take. This time, I played slower, letting each note linger before moving to the next. My voice wove through the chords, soft, steady. I listened closely through my headphones as I sang, making sure there were no strange noises this time. When I finished, I replayed the recording. There it was again, the static, a faint, whispering hiss, threaded through the track like something hiding in the background. My pulse quickened. I uploaded the file to my laptop and pulled up my audio software. I ran a spectral analysis, trying to isolate the distortion. The waveform looked normal at first, but when I zoomed in on the section where the static occurred, I saw something unusual. A faint, irregular spike, like a sound that wasn't supposed to be there. I increased the gain, amplifying the section. At first, it was just noise. A breath, maybe. A hint of something just beyond perception. I adjusted the filters, stripping away the background hum. The whisper sharpened. A single syllable. Soft. Almost pleading. My skin prickled. I played it again, leaning in, straining to make it out. And that was when I felt it. A shift in the air. Like something had changed in the house. Before, the silence had been natural, like the house was simply empty. Now, it felt different. The stillness pressed in around me, thick, waiting. A soft creak came from upstairs. I froze. The house was supposed to be empty. I told myself it was nothing. Old with settling. The wind shifting against the frame. But I still found myself glancing toward the doorway. The entrance hall stretched beyond, dark and yawning. The grand staircase wound up into shadows, its steps barely visible in the dim light. Another creak. This time, it sounded closer. I swallowed hard and reached for the door, shutting it. The lock clicked into place. Just in case. I took a deep breath, forcing a laugh under my breath. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered. The words felt hollow in the heavy air. I turned back to my laptop. The whisper was still waiting for me. I needed to know what it said. I adjusted the audio further, isolating the frequency, enhancing the clarity. The whisper became sharper, words forming in the static. A sentence. Short. Barely more than a breath. I hit play. "I'm right behind you." A chill slid down my spine. I sat completely still. My own breath was too loud in my ears. My hands, resting on the laptop keyboard, felt numb. Slowly, so slowly, I turned my head. Nothing. Just the empty room. The dusty furniture draped in sheets. But my heart hammered against my ribs. I had been alone. The entire time. Hadn't I? The recording was still playing. The whisper looped again, soft, deliberate. "I'm right behind you." I shut the laptop. I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep recording anymore. I sat in front of my laptop, staring at the closed screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. It had to be a glitch. Some kind of interference, maybe. A stray radio signal bleeding into the recording. That happens sometimes, right? I swallowed and forced myself to open the laptop again. The waveform still flickered on the screen, waiting. I hesitated, then pressed play. "I'm right behind you." The whisper was clearer this time. Closer. It wasn't just background noise anymore. It carried depth, presence, like someone had been standing right next to me when it was recorded. I turned sharply, my chair scraping against the dusty floorboards. The room was empty. Just my equipment, the draped furniture, and the dim light filtering through the cracks in the boarded windows. But the feeling was still there. That suffocating awareness of being watched. I exhaled shakily, running a hand through my hair. This was ridiculous. I didn't believe in ghosts. But then why did the air feel heavier? Why did the silence press against my skin like a tangible thing? I closed the laptop again, my fingers trembling slightly. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the house was getting to me. But then the lamp on the table flickered, and in the corner of my eye, something moved. I snapped my head toward the motion. Nothing. Just the sheet-covered furniture, the tall, dusty shelves. I exhaled, shaking my head. I needed to get a grip. Standing up, I stretched, rolling my shoulders. I walked toward my guitar, planning to strum a few chords, to ground myself, to remind myself that I was here, in control. The guitar wasn't where I left it. I frowned. I had set it down next to the mic stand, but now it was leaning against the far wall. Had I moved it? I walked over, picked it up, and froze. The back of the guitar was cold. Not just cool, freezing, like it had been sitting outside in winter air. A slow, uneasy shiver crept down my spine. Then I felt it. A breath. Not my own. Cold, whispering across the nape of my neck. I spun around, heart pounding. The room was empty, but the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew worse, like something lingered just outside my vision, slipping between the shadows, waiting for me to turn my back again. I took a step back, my breath unsteady. The lamp flickered again. The edges of the room seemed darker now, like the shadows had deepened, stretched. I needed to get out of here. I grabbed my phone, my fingers stiff with cold, and dialed the only person I knew would answer. "Yo, Ethan. What's up?" Mark's voice was casual, distracted, like he was halfway through a game or tinkering with some new sound rig. "Hey, my voice came out rough. I cleared my throat. I need you to check something for me." There was a beat of silence, then a curious hum. "All right, what am I looking at?" I pulled the file from my laptop and sent it over. "Just listen to this. Tell me what you hear." Mark was a sound engineer, like me, more skeptical than I was, if that was even possible. If anyone could debunk this, it was him. A moment passed, then another. I heard the soft click of his keyboard as he adjusted the audio, then a long pause. "Okay," he said slowly. "That's weird." I let out a breath. "You hear it too?" "Yeah, and I've got no clue what it is." I ran a hand over my face. "It's got to be some kind of interference, right? Maybe a frequency issue? Some radio transmission bleeding through." Mark hesitated. "No, that's not feedback. That's not distortion." His voice was quieter now. "That's an actual voice." A chill wrapped around my ribs. I didn't say anything. Mark's keyboard clacked again. "Hang on, I'm enhancing it." I waited, my grip tightening around the phone. Then he spoke again. "Ethan, I think there's another layer beneath it." I stiffened. "What?" More typing. A soft static hum crackled through my speaker. Then, barely audible beneath the first whisper, came something else. A deeper voice. Guttural. Slow. It said my name. I stopped breathing. Mark's voice dropped to a whisper. "Dude, get out of there." Mark's words echoed in my ears. "Dude, get out of there." I didn't need to be told twice. Heart pounding, I grabbed my gear, shoving my laptop and recorder into my bag. My hands were shaking as I reached for the doorknob, twisting it hard. It didn't move. I twisted again, harder. The lock clicked, but the door refused to budge. I yanked with both hands, my breath coming fast. Nothing. It was stuck. No, not stuck. It felt held, like something on the other side was pressing back. The whispers started again. Not just one voice now. Many. All around me. Soft, overlapping murmurs, curling against my ears like cold breath. The voices weren't speaking words. Not yet. Just hushed sounds, layered and shifting, an eerie cadence with no source. I stumbled back, my head whipping from side to side. The room was empty, but the voices were still there, closing in. I spun, looking for another way out. The windows were boarded up, but maybe I could. Then I saw it. A tall, dusty mirror leaned against the far wall, its glass cloudy with age. And in the reflection, I wasn't alone. I went cold. A figure stood behind me. Tall, shadowy, featureless except for the vague outline of a head and shoulders, its shape wavering like smoke. My stomach lurched. I spun around. Nothing. The room was empty. But when I turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there. And now it was smiling. A slow, unnatural curve of a mouth that shouldn't have been there. I stumbled backward, my pulse hammering. The reflection didn't move with me. It just stood there, smiling. Then, its head tilted. Not like a person, like something imitating one. The whispers surged, louder now, rushing through my ears in a suffocating tide. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I did the only thing I could. I grabbed the nearest object and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, shards raining to the floor. For a split second, silence. Then, laughter. A slow, distorted chuckle, deep and ragged, vibrating through the walls. Something was coming. I ran. I didn't care where. I just needed to get away from that sound, from whatever was in this house with me. I crashed into the hallway, my boots skidding against the dust-covered floor. The whispers chased me, slithering through the air like unseen fingers brushing my skin. I reached the main hall, chest heaving, and ripped my recording gear from my bag. Maybe this was it. Maybe the house, the voices, maybe it was all tied to the recordings. I grabbed my laptop and smashed it against the floor. The screen cracked, but the whispers didn't stop. I crushed my microphone under my heel. Still, the murmurs crawled through my skull. I grabbed my recorder and hurled it against the wall. It shattered into pieces, plastic and wires scattering across the floor. For a moment, silence. Then, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged in the air. The whispers turned to ragged, shuddering breaths. Then the sound of something moving. Not footsteps. Something scraping. Crawling. I turned. At the far end of the hallway, beyond the flickering light of my dying lamp, A shape pulled itself from the shadows, tall but hunched, moving on all fours. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin, bending in places they shouldn't. Its fingers curled against the floor, nails scraping against the wood as it dragged itself forward. It had no face, just smooth, empty skin. But somehow I knew. It was looking at me, and it was smiling. I couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. The whispers surrounded me, rising, filling my head, my bones, my breath. I fumbled for my bag, my fingers numb, and pulled out my backup recorder. The only thing I had left. I pressed play. The recording crackled. The static was gone now. Only one voice remained. No longer distant. No longer a whisper. Right in my ear. Don't leave me alone. My body locked up. Then, a final sound. Slow. Distorted. A chuckle. The lights went out. And something moved in the darkness. The moment the lights died, the world became a void. I didn't think. I just ran. Something brushed against my arm. A freezing touch that sent a jolt of panic through me. I barreled forward, slamming into the door, and it swung open on its own. The whispers surged behind me, rising into a wailing cacophony, but I didn't stop. I tore across the overgrown lawn, stumbling over roots and broken stones. The night air was frigid, but I welcomed it, gulping down each breath as I ran. My car was still parked where I left it, half hidden by the skeletal branches of dead trees. My hands fumbled for the keys, shaking so badly that I dropped them twice before finally unlocking the door. I threw myself inside, slammed the door shut, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel as I sped down the dirt road, gravel crunching under my tires. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I just kept driving. I wasn't stopping. Not until that house was miles behind me. Not until I knew I was safe. Or at least, I thought I was. Hours later, I sat in my apartment, staring at my laptop. The dim glow of the screen was the only light in the room. I had dumped everything, the corrupted files, the ruined recordings, into the trash folder. My finger hovered over the delete button. I had to erase it. Every trace of that night. I clicked. The files vanished. I let out a slow breath, my muscles finally unclenching. Then, a new file appeared. My stomach twisted. I hadn't put that there. The name was simple, just a timestamp. I checked the metadata. It had been created after I left the mansion. I hesitated, then clicked play. At first, just silence. Then, the sound of breathing. Not static, not distortion, breathing. Then my own voice, low and quiet. "You can't leave me." I stopped breathing. The voice on the recording. It was me, but I didn't remember saying those words. The file wasn't over. A faint rustling sound, like someone shifting in the dark. Then the voice again, softer this time. "I followed you home." I slammed the laptop shut. No, this wasn't real. I was tired, shaken. My mind was playing tricks on me. I pushed away from my desk, rubbing my face with both hands. Then I saw it. Not in the room, not in the window, in the dark reflection of my monitor. A figure, standing behind me, tall, motionless, smiling. The screen flickered and went black. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 32 years old, an IT technician for a mid-sized financial firm and a firm believer in logic. I don't waste time on ghost stories, superstitions, or things that go bump in the night. There's always an explanation: faulty wiring, a draft, human imagination running wild. That belief was unshakable, until the night I stayed late to fix a server issue. Our office was located on the 34th floor of a massive corporate high-rise, a towering structure of glass and steel. By day, it was a hive of activity, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, people moving in and out of conference rooms. But at night, it was a different place. By 11 p.m., the last stragglers had left, their footsteps fading down the hall as the automatic lights dimmed behind them. I barely noticed. My focus was on the server logs, lines of code scrolling endlessly on my screen. Midnight came and went. By 2:30 a.m., I was done. Exhausted but satisfied, I packed up my laptop and stretched. The office was dead silent except for the low hum of electronics. Overhead, The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting momentary shadows across the gray carpeting. Nothing unusual. I'd seen them do that 100 times. I grabbed my bag, locked my workstation, and made my way to the elevators. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. The security desk in the lobby was empty. Mike, the night guard, was usually half asleep at his station, his radio playing old rock songs at low volume. But now, his chair was pushed back, his coffee cup half full, the whole area deserted. I frowned. Maybe he was making his rounds. Shaking it off, I pressed the elevator button. Nothing. No light. No familiar ding. I pressed it again. Still nothing. With a sigh, I turned toward the stairwell. I had taken these stairs plenty of times, usually when the elevators were packed during rush hour. I knew exactly how far it was to the door, how many steps it would take to get there. Except tonight, the hallway seemed longer. At first, I thought it was just my exhaustion playing tricks on me. But as I walked, the distance stretched unnaturally. The office doors on either side, identical, unremarkable, felt slightly off. Names on the plaques looked unfamiliar. I stopped, looked around. I had been working in this building for 6 years. I should have recognized every door. But I didn't. My stomach tightened. This wasn't the hallway I knew. I exhaled sharply, rubbing my temples. You're exhausted. You just need to focus. Turning around, I walked back the way I came. Except, I didn't. The hallway should have led me straight back to the office, where I had just packed up my things. But the numbers on the doors, room 3412, 3414, 3416, weren't right. I worked in 3421. I should have passed it already. I turned again, expecting to see the glow of my monitor through the glass walls of my workspace. Instead, the hallway stretched further than it should have, a sterile tunnel of gray carpet and identical office doors. A trick of perspective? Maybe I was more tired than I thought. I walked faster. The air around me felt denser, like the building itself was pressing in. My footsteps sounded muffled, swallowed by the thick silence. Then I heard it. Soft, faint. Footsteps behind me. I stopped. The sound stopped. My breath hitched as I turned my head slowly. The corridor was empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly. I swallowed hard. Mike? I almost called out, but some deep, instinctual part of my brain told me not to. I kept walking faster now. Every door I passed, I tried to handle. Locked, locked, locked. Then one opened. I pushed the door open cautiously. The room inside was wrong. Identical to every other office, but sterile, too clean. The desk, the chair, the computer, everything looked untouched. No coffee rings, no personal items. As if no one had ever worked there. I backed out and shut the door, heart pounding. I glanced to the side, at the long window lining the hallway. My reflection looked back at me, pale under the fluorescent glow. I turned my head slightly, my reflection did the same. Then it blinked. A full second after I did. I stumbled back, my breath coming faster now. My hand went to my pocket, fumbling for my phone. No signal. My eyes flicked to the wall clock. 2:33 a.m. I checked my watch. It read the same. The second hand wasn't moving. A chill ran through me. I turned the corner, then froze. There, in the dim light ahead, were footprints. My footprints. The same pattern from my office shoes, leading into the darkness. But I haven't walked this way yet. My hands clenched into fists. The air felt thicker now, like it was weighing me down. I ran. But no matter how fast I moved, the hallway stretched endlessly, doors blurring past me. The overhead lights flickered, buzzing erratically. My breath was ragged, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then, the footsteps behind me started again. I ran. My footsteps pounded against the carpet, my breath coming in sharp gasps. But no matter how fast I moved, the hallway stretched endlessly ahead of me. The walls blurred past, sterile and unmarked. The overhead lights buzzed louder, flickering in and out. Then, subtly, almost imperceptibly, the world around me began to change. The lights dimmed. Not all at once, but gradually, like a slow sunset of artificial fluorescence. Shadows deepened along the walls, pooling into the corners like thick ink. The hallway, once spacious and monotonous, now felt tighter, suffocating. The walls seemed closer, like a throat tightening around me. Then came the sound. A low, droning hum vibrated through the air. Not from the lights, not from the vents, but from everywhere. It wasn't loud, but I felt it in my bones, like standing too close to a massive machine. It settled into my chest, making my heartbeat feel sluggish, unnatural. And that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just barely visible in the dim light, a figure stood. Tall. Too tall. Its body was elongated, stretched unnaturally thin, its limbs slightly too long for comfort. Its face, if it had one, was obscured, swallowed by the surrounding darkness. It didn't move. I blinked. It was closer. I staggered back, my pulse spiking. The air felt heavier, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart hammering. This isn't real. This isn't real. When I opened them again, it was closer still. A shudder ripped through me. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to move, to run. I wrenched at the nearest door. Locked. The next. Locked. The third door gave way. I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. My fingers trembled as I pressed against the smooth wood, listening. The hum in the air hadn't stopped, but the hallway outside was silent. Then I turned around. A stairwell. It spiraled downward, vanishing into complete darkness below. No emergency lights, no glow from the floors below. Just black, gaping, and infinite. I hesitated. Anything is better than the hallway. But as I stepped toward the stairs, a faint red glow caught my eye. An exit sign. Relief surged through me. I bolted out of the office, straight toward the glowing sign. But as I ran, the hallway stretched again, lengthening with every step. The exit sign pulled away from me, always just out of reach. My legs burned, my breath hitched. No matter how fast I ran, I wasn't getting any closer. I skidded to a stop, gasping. My eyes darted around. There on the glass wall beside me, a reflection. My own. Except, I wasn't moving. The figure in the glass stood still, staring directly at me. And then, slowly, it smiled. My stomach clenched. I wasn't smiling. I took a shaky step back. The reflection didn't. I opened my mouth to scream, to curse, to do something. And then, a whisper, right next to my ear. Low, breathy, almost amused. You shouldn't have stayed so late. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs. The hallway was empty. The whisper still lingered in the air, curling around me like smoke. I took a shaky step back, my breath coming fast and shallow. My reflection in the glass was normal again. No eerie smile, no delay, but I no longer trusted it. Then the lights flickered. Not just a brief, passing blink, this was violent. The fluorescence above me strobed wildly, casting jerky shadows that seemed to lurch and stretch. The hum in the air escalated into a low, bone-rattling drone. I turned to the nearest door and yanked it open. It led to another hallway. Not an office. Not a stairwell. Just the same identical corridor stretching ahead. I slammed it shut, spun around, and tried another door. Another hallway. I tried again. And again. Every door, every single one, led to the same endless passage. A tremor ran through me. My mind struggled to hold on to logic, but there was no logic here. My reality had folded in on itself, twisted into something that didn't obey the rules of space and time. Then I noticed it. The figure, closer now, still motionless, but its head, its impossibly long, featureless head, had tilted to the side, just slightly. A shudder rolled down my spine. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping my head. Wake up. This isn't real. It's a stress dream. Wake up. Then my phone buzzed. I nearly dropped it. My hands trembled as I fished it from my pocket. The screen glowed against the dim hallway. A single message. From an unknown number. Turn around. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me not to. But my body moved anyway. Slowly. As if something else had taken control. I turned my head. The entity stood just feet away. My breath caught in my throat. It loomed over me. Its elongated form hunched slightly to fit within the hallway's ceiling. Its limbs were too long, its fingers too thin. But its face, there was nothing. No eyes, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless darkness. And yet, it was mouthing something. Soundless, wordless. But I felt it. A pressure built in my ears, as if I were sinking deep underwater. The hum in the walls became whispers, dozens of them, overlapping, slithering through my skull. I staggered back. My vision swam. The thing did not move. It simply existed, its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't escape. Then, slowly, deliberately, it lifted a hand and pointed. I followed its gesture. At the end of the hall, there was a door. Unlike the sterile office doors, this one was different. Wooden, old, the paint peeling in long, curling strips. I swallowed hard. I didn't want to go near it. But when I turned back, the entity was right behind me. I could feel it, breathless, silent, pressing against the fabric of reality itself. With no other choice, my trembling fingers reached for the handle. I gasped and jolted upright in my chair. My heart hammered against my ribs, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gulps. The glow of my computer screen flickered in front of me, casting a dull light across the empty office. I blinked. Was I back? The room looked exactly as I'd left it. My coffee cup half empty, my bag still resting on the chair beside me. The server diagnostics on my monitor displayed a completed repair log. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, steady and unbroken. I turned slowly, my hands gripping the armrests. No endless hallway, no warped reality, just the office. Silent, normal. I exhaled, my body trembling with relief. Then I checked the time. 2:34 a.m. My breath caught. Only 1 minute had passed. No, that's impossible. I grabbed my phone, my fingers ice cold against the glass. No missed calls, no strange messages. The screen showed the same familiar layout, as if nothing had happened. I stood quickly, almost knocking over my chair. I needed to leave. Now, the hallway outside my office was exactly as it should be. Short, familiar, leading straight to the elevator. No endless stretch of doors. No flickering lights. Nothing waiting for me at the end. I pressed the elevator button. It lit up. With a soft chime, the doors slid open. I stepped inside, my pulse still erratic as I jabbed the button for the lobby. The doors closed, and the elevator hummed softly as it descended. I should have felt relief, but something wasn't right. The air was different. The sterile scent of the office lingered, but beneath it was something else, something I couldn't name. The faintest distortion in reality, like the world itself had been stretched and then hurriedly put back together. The door slid open, and I stepped outside into the cold night air. The parking lot was empty. The streetlights cast long, unmoving shadows against the pavement. I inhaled deeply, trying to shake the lingering unease. You're fine. It was just a dream, a hallucination. Stress and exhaustion playing tricks on you. Then my phone buzzed. I flinched, the sound sharp in the quiet. A new notification. I frowned, unlocking my phone. Voice memos. New recording. I hesitated. My thumb hovered over the play button. I didn't remember recording anything. Swallowing hard, I pressed play. For a moment, there was only static. A faint, garbled whisper in the background, just barely distinguishable. Then, my own voice. Flat, emotionless. You never left. A chill shot through me. My stomach twisted as dread coiled in my gut. My breath hitched. Slowly, so slowly, I lifted my head. The office building's glass doors reflected the empty street behind me. And there, in the reflection, I saw myself, standing completely still. But my reflection wasn't facing forward. It was turned toward me. And then, in the dim glow of the streetlights, it smiled. The screen cut to black. I've never been one to believe in ghosts, curses, or things that go bump in the night. Superstition has always felt like an excuse for people to explain what they don't understand. I deal in facts, logic. That's why I write horror stories, not because I believe in them, but because I know how to craft fear from the ordinary. But what happened in that forest? I still can't explain. My name is Ethan Graves. I'm 29, a freelance writer, and I make a living writing horror novels that are more psychological than supernatural. Lately, though, I'd hit a creative wall. The last few months had been a haze of half-finished drafts and stories that lacked the spark to keep readers up at night. I needed something real to pull from, something to unsettle me, to make me uneasy. That's how I convinced myself that camping alone in a remote forest was a good idea. I chose a stretch of dense woodland about 3 hours outside of town. It wasn't a popular hiking spot, and that was exactly the point. I wanted isolation. No traffic noise, no internet, no distractions. Just the sounds of the wilderness and the kind of silence that lets the imagination wander. It was early October, the air crisp but not unbearable, perfect for a few nights under the stars. The drive up was uneventful. The last few miles were on a narrow dirt road barely wide enough for my car, the trees pressing in from both sides. When I finally reached a small clearing, I stepped out and took in the surroundings. Tall pines and oaks loomed overhead, their branches knitting together like skeletal fingers. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. But what struck me most, what I should have paid attention to, was the silence. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just stillness. I told myself it was normal, that maybe I'd arrived at an odd hour when the wildlife was simply dormant. Still, something about it felt wrong, as if the whole forest were holding its breath. I set up my tent near the clearing's edge, facing a line of gnarled trees that looked ancient, their bark twisted and blackened in places. As I arranged my campsite, I noticed a peculiar detail, a ring of small stones encircling the area where I'd pitched my tent. The stones weren't haphazardly scattered by nature. They were deliberately placed, forming an unbroken circle about 10 feet in diameter. I crouched down, running my fingers over one of them. Weathered smooth. Someone had put them here. Probably just some old campsite marker. I muttered to myself, brushing away the unease that curled in my stomach. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows stretched long and distorted across the forest floor. The trees cast twisted, humanoid shapes in the fading light, figures that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I blamed my tired eyes, the way the mind plays tricks when the world dims. By the time I got a fire going, night had settled in completely. The fire crackled, sending flickers of orange light dancing against the trunks of the nearest trees. Beyond that, only darkness. An impossible, swallowing blackness that my flashlight barely seemed to penetrate. I tried to focus on writing. Notebook open, pen scratching against paper, but every so often, I'd pause. The feeling of being watched had crept in, slow and insidious. It wasn't paranoia, it was something else. The silence had taken on a weight, pressing against my ears. No wind, no leaves stirring, just the crackle of my fire and the steady rhythm of my own breath. Then, at midnight, a sound, a rustling in the underbrush. I snapped my head up, heart suddenly hammering. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. I exhaled, shaking my head. Probably just a raccoon or a fox. But as I turned back to my notebook, a thought lodged itself deep in my mind. If it was an animal, why hadn't I heard it before it got that close? I forced a laugh under my breath, trying to shake the unease. It's just an animal. The darkness plays tricks on the mind. You're alone out here. Nothing's watching you. But as I sat back down by the fire, my hands felt clammy against my notebook. The flames crackled and flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the clearing. At first, I barely noticed it, the way the darkness seemed to stretch and recoil with the fire's movement. But after a few minutes, something felt off. The shadows weren't just shifting naturally. They were moving in ways that didn't make sense. I glanced up, beyond the firelight, where the trees stood in clusters. The spaces between them darkened, deepened, until they looked almost like figures standing just out of reach. Tall, thin, motionless. I sucked in a sharp breath. I wasn't looking directly at them, just catching them in my peripheral vision. The second I turned my head to focus on them, they disappeared, dissolving into the blackness of the forest. My grip tightened around my pen. The mind fills in the gaps. You know this. Flickering light, shifting shadows. That's all it is. I forced myself to return to my notebook, scratching out ideas, but the words felt empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just outside the fire's reach, watching, waiting. Then I heard it. A whisper. Not words, not a distinct voice, just a breathy, drawn-out sound, carried by the wind. I tensed. My skin prickled. The sound wasn't coming from in front of me. It was behind me. Slowly, I turned my head, but the moment I moved, The whisper shifted, always staying just behind me, just out of reach. The hair on my arms stood on end. Wind through the trees, I told myself. It's just the wind. But then my notebook pages ruffled, flipping over as if someone had just run their fingers across them. I froze. The air was still. There was no breeze. I stared at the pages, willing myself to find a logical explanation. But deep inside, something in me knew. This wasn't normal. I snapped the notebook shut and ran a hand down my face. You're tired. That's all. I needed to take a break, to reset. Standing, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from the fire. The darkness swallowed me immediately, pressing in on all sides as I walked toward the trees. I had just finished relieving myself when I heard something, a soft shuffling noise, like feet shifting against leaves. I lifted my flashlight, and that's when I saw it. Just beyond the tree-line, a figure stood. A black silhouette, tall, unnaturally thin, completely motionless. No details, no eyes, no face, just an absence of light in the shape of a person. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I blinked, and it was gone, just gone. The trees stood still, empty, as if nothing had been there at all. My breathing was ragged now. My pulse hammered in my ears. I turned on my heel and walked briskly back to the fire, refusing to look over my shoulder. A trick of the mind. Sleep deprivation. Shadows. Back at my tent, I yanked the zipper shut and sat inside, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. I told myself I'd be fine, that I just needed rest. But as I lay down, the feeling of being watched never faded. Even with my eyes closed, I could feel it. Something was still out there, waiting. I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My limbs were heavy, my thoughts sluggish, as if something had drained the energy out of me during the night. But what unsettled me the most was the silence. The forest was still wrong. No birds, no rustling leaves, no insects buzzing in the damp morning air. Just a thick, unnatural quiet that made my skin crawl. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, my breath misting in the cool morning air. The fire had burned down to cold embers, and the clearing looked just as I had left it. Almost. That's when I saw them. Footprints. A trail of them circled my tent, pressed into the dirt where there should have been none. They weren't mine. The shape was different, too elongated, and the spacing was off, as if whatever had made them had been moving in long, unnatural strides. I crouched down, tracing the edge of one with my finger. The strangest part was how they started and stopped abruptly, as if whatever had left them had simply appeared and then vanished. A chill ran down my spine. I needed to get out of here. I moved quickly, stuffing my sleeping bag into my pack, rolling up my tent with shaking hands. My mind fought to rationalize, to make sense of what was happening. Someone must have come through while I was asleep. Maybe some hiker messing with me. Maybe. No. I knew, deep down, that wasn't it. By the time I had my gear packed, my nerves were raw. I pulled out my phone, but the GPS wouldn't load, just the little spinning icon searching for a signal that never came. No matter. I had a paper map. I walked to where the trail should have been, the one I had taken the day before, but the path wasn't there. I spun in place, scanning the trees. Maybe I had gotten turned around. Maybe the clearing had disoriented me. I moved in a different direction, following what looked like a trail, but after 10 minutes of walking, I stepped right back into the clearing. I stopped. My stomach twisted. I tried again. Another direction. Another path. Another stretch of trees that should have led out. And yet, I was back in the clearing. A tightness crept into my chest. My pulse pounded in my ears. This isn't possible. No matter which way I walked, I ended up right back where I started. I dropped my pack by the fire pit and sat down, forcing myself to breathe. Panic wouldn't help. I needed to think. As I sat there, rubbing my temples, a movement caught my eye. I looked up. The trees at the edge of the clearing had darkened. Not the trees themselves, but the spaces between them. Figures stood there, the same ones from last night. Only now, they were visible in the daylight. Tall, thin, perfectly still. My stomach lurched. My hands clenched into fists. I swallowed, forcing my voice to work. Hey, my voice cracked slightly, but I ignored it. Who's out there? No response. I grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it. It vanished into the shadows between the trees. No impact. No sound of it landing. Nothing. I blinked. The figures were closer. I scrambled backward, my breath coming fast. They hadn't moved, but they had. The way a dream shifts when you're not looking directly at it. I squeezed my eyes shut, shook my head. This isn't happening. This isn't real. But when I opened them again, they were inside the clearing. The sun sank behind the trees faster than it should have. One moment it was mid-afternoon, and the next, the sky had darkened into a deep, suffocating gray. I had built a fire, determined to keep the light going, to push back the encroaching dark. But something was wrong with the air. Every time I got the flames steady, they flickered violently, as if something was suffocating them. The smoke curled unnaturally, pulled toward the trees as if drawn by invisible hands. And the whispers, they were back, not faint anymore, not a breathy suggestion carried by the wind. They were louder now, overlapping voices, speaking in a language I didn't understand, coming from every direction at once. I gritted my teeth, staring at the fire, refusing to look at the shadows pressing in around me. But I felt them, standing right at the edge of the light, waiting. The firelight flickered, casting unsteady, jagged shapes against the trees. I sat rigid, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Then I saw them, a perfect ring of figures surrounding my campsite. They stood on all sides, forming a seamless barrier between me and the rest of the world. Dark, elongated silhouettes, their edges flickering like heat distortion. They weren't just standing still anymore. They were swaying, subtly, like trees shifting in a non-existent wind. I gritted my teeth, squeezing my hands into fists. This was a nightmare. It had to be. I forced myself to breathe. Don't look at them. Don't acknowledge them. I closed my eyes for just a second, trying to steady my thoughts. But when I opened them again, they were closer. No movement. No sound. Just nearer. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. The fire between us felt weaker, as if whatever was out there was draining the light itself. Then, from the silence, the whispers returned. But this time, they didn't surround me. They were right behind me. My body went cold, every nerve screaming at me to move, to run, to do something. But I was frozen. The voices, once scattered and overlapping, had converged into one. A single, breathy voice that spoke directly into my ear. Why did you come here? The words weren't angry. They weren't welcoming, either. They just were. My breath hitched. My hands clenched the dirt beneath me. Then, the fire snapped violently, sparks shooting into the air like firecrackers. And then it died. Not faded. Not smothered. 1 second it was burning, and the next, it was simply gone. Darkness swallowed the clearing whole. Panic finally shattered whatever paralysis had gripped me. I lunged for my flashlight, clicked it on, and bolted into the woods. Branches lashed against my arms and legs as I ran blindly, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. The forest felt wrong. The trees were taller, stretching impossibly high, their trunks twisting unnaturally. The path beneath my feet was stretching, distorting, pulling me deeper instead of leading me out. I didn't care. I just kept running. But no matter how fast I moved, no matter how erratic my path, I wasn't escaping them. Because they weren't chasing me. Not actively. They were simply always just behind me. I could hear them, soft, deliberate movements in the leaves, in the branches, in the shadows that danced at the edges of my vision. I made the mistake of looking back. They were closer. Not running. Not lunging. Just there. My breath came in ragged gasps. My legs burned. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. The forest began to change. The trees thinned, and ahead of me, something took shape in the darkness. Large, looming structures. I stumbled into a clearing, and nearly collapsed. A circle of standing stones rose before me, ancient and covered in deep, unfamiliar carvings. The symbols weren't just etched into the rock. They glowed, pulsing faintly with a light that wasn't from my flashlight. The air was heavier here, thick with something primal, something that had existed long before I ever set foot in this forest. I fell to my knees, my chest heaving. This wasn't just a forest. It was something older, something wrong. and I wasn't supposed to be here. I knelt in the center of the standing stones, my heart pounding so hard it shook my ribs. The air was thick, charged, like the moments before a violent storm. The glowing symbols pulsed in rhythm with my breath. Then, one by one, they faded, swallowed by the darkness. The whispers stopped. The figures no longer loomed at the edges of my vision. The suffocating weight pressing against my skull, my chest, my very thoughts, lifted. And then, as if the forest itself had exhaled, the trees shifted. The warped, endless expanse of impossible darkness receded, the twisted paths straightened. And in front of me, clear as day, the trail home stretched through the trees. I didn't question it. I didn't hesitate. I ran. The trail was solid beneath my feet, the dirt real, the air sharp and cold. I moved as fast as I could, my muscles aching, my breath burning in my throat. Then, finally, my car, sitting exactly where I had left it at the forest's edge. My hands fumbled with the keys as I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut and locking it instinctively. My fingers trembled as I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I nearly sobbed in relief. I pressed the gas, tires kicking up gravel as I sped away. But just as I reached the bend in the road, something made me glance at the rearview mirror. They were there, lining the tree line. A dozen, no, hundreds of them, perfectly still, watching. The last thing I saw before the forest disappeared behind me was one of them lifting a hand and waving. I didn't stop driving until I reached my apartment. I locked the doors, shut every curtain, left every light on, and then I sat at my desk, my fingers shaking as I opened my notebook. I had to write it down, every detail, every impossible, horrifying moment. I needed proof, even if it was just for myself. Hours passed as I scrawled everything into the pages, trying to make sense of it. Then, somewhere near dawn, I flipped back through my notes, and my stomach turned to ice. There were extra pages, pages I didn't write. The handwriting wasn't mine. The ink was darker, fresher, and the last entry simply read, "You were never supposed to leave." My name is Michael Reeves. I'm a roofing contractor, 35 years old, and I've been in this line of work for nearly 2 decades. I don't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of that nonsense. I deal in things I can see and touch: wood, shingles, nails, and the occasional bad weather. So when I got the call about an old Victorian house in a small rural town, I didn't think twice about taking the job. It was a simple roof repair, and from what I could tell, the owner, some out-of-town investor, just wanted the place patched up to put it on the market. Easy money. When I arrived, I understood why no one had touched the place in years. The house sat on a lonely plot at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by overgrown trees that clawed at its weather-beaten walls. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood exposed to the elements. The windows were covered in grime, and the porch sagged under its own weight. But the roof was the worst part. Parts of it had collapsed inward, and other sections sagged unnaturally, as if something heavy had been standing on them for years. At the hardware store in town, I stopped to grab extra supplies. When I mentioned the house, the cashier, an older man with leathery skin, froze mid-scan. "You working on that place?" he asked, lowering his voice. "Yeah, just fixing up the roof." A few of the other customers turned to look at me. I wasn't expecting applause, but their expressions were something else. Uneasy, like I had just told them I was heading into a storm without an umbrella. "You should finish up before dark," the cashier said, handing me my receipt. A younger guy near the door scoffed. "If you finish it all." I wanted to ask what that meant, but I didn't. Town gossip didn't concern me. If they wanted to believe in ghost stories, that was their business. I reached the house just before 4 p.m. The air was still, heavy with the smell of damp wood. No birds, no wind, just silence. I climbed up my ladder and got to work. For the first hour, everything was normal. Just me, my tools, and the slow rhythm of hammering nails. The roof creaked under my weight, but I'd expected that. I focused on replacing a particularly damaged section, occasionally glancing at the horizon to track the sun's descent. Then, the wind picked up. It wasn't natural, not the usual breeze you'd expect in open country. It was sudden, sharp, almost surgical in the way it cut through the air. My shirt rippled, and loose shingles rattled like fingers drumming against wood. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound. I paused, my hammer mid-swing. The sound came again. A slow, deliberate drag of something against the shingles. I turned my head, scanning the roof. Nothing. Just a few broken tiles, some tools, and an old chimney. Shaking it off, I went back to work. Probably just a branch brushing against the house. But a few minutes later, I saw him. I had turned to adjust a tile when my eyes caught movement on the neighboring rooftop. A man. Tall. Thin. He stood on the peak of the house next door, facing me. His clothes were old, tattered rags hanging loosely from his gaunt frame. His arms dangled at his sides, too still, like he wasn't breathing. But his eyes were what made my stomach turn. They were completely white. No pupils, no irises, just two empty, staring voids. And he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I blinked. The man was gone. I hadn't looked away for more than a second, just long enough to grab my hammer. But when my eyes flicked back to the neighboring roof, it was empty. No sign of movement. No shifting shadows. Just a bare, weathered rooftop under the dimming sky. I straightened up, scanning the area. There was no way he could have climbed down that fast. Even if he'd jumped, I would have heard something. A thud, a grunt, anything. But there was only silence. Maybe I'd imagined him. I exhaled, shaking my head. A trick of the light, maybe. Or exhaustion. I'd been working all day, and I still had a few hours to go before calling it quits. Still, I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. I got back to work, but my rhythm was off. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the rooftops, the treetops, the empty windows of the house below. Nothing. And yet, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was subtle at first, like a distant itch in my brain, but it grew stronger the longer I ignored it. A slow, creeping pressure on the back of my neck, an awareness just outside my field of vision. No matter how fast I turned my head, I never caught anything. Just an empty stretch of shingles and sky. Then there was the wind. It wasn't like before. Before, it had been sharp and sudden. Now, it was constant, flowing across the rooftop in steady gusts. But it carried something with it. A sound. At first, I thought it was just the rustling of leaves, the settling of an old house. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. A murmur. Indistinct, just at the edge of hearing. It was like a voice, but not quite. Not words, just the shape of them. A whisper threading through the wind, curling around my ears, vanishing the moment I tried to focus on it. The sun was sinking now, stretching shadows across the rooftops. The house's twisted angles made them look unnatural, too long, too thin, moving in ways that didn't make sense. I turned back to my work, trying to shake the tension out of my shoulders. I shouldn't be out here much longer. I reached for another tile, adjusted my footing, and then I saw him again. This time, he was closer, perched on the chimney stack not 10 feet away. His posture hadn't changed. He was still motionless, still staring, but now his head was tilted slightly, like he was studying me, like he was curious. My breath hitched. His feet weren't balanced on the chimney's narrow ledge. He wasn't gripping it for support. He was just there, standing as if gravity didn't apply to him. A cold rush of adrenaline shot through my limbs. I staggered back, nearly losing my balance. My boot scraped against a loose tile, sending it tumbling over the edge of the roof. It shattered somewhere below. I steadied myself, heart pounding. And just like before, he was gone. No movement, no trace, nothing. Only the whispering wind and the lengthening shadows. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't alone. And I needed to get off this roof. Enough. I wasn't going to stand here playing games with my own imagination. My nerves were frayed, my gut was tight, and I wasn't getting paid enough to deal with whatever the hell this was. I exhaled sharply and started packing up my tools, shoving them into my toolbox with more force than necessary. Every instinct told me to get down now. As I reached for my last hammer, something caught my eye. A window below me, part of the house's second floor. The glass was old and warped, coated in decades of grime, but it still reflected the rooftop. And in that reflection, the man was standing right behind me. I stopped breathing. He was close. Too close. His pale, white eyes bored into mine through the warped glass. His arms hung slack, his head tilted just slightly, as if waiting for something. Every hair on my body stood on end. I spun around. Nothing. The rooftop was empty. Just a few loose shingles and the cooling evening air. I turned back to the window. The reflection was empty now. I swallowed hard. My hands were trembling. You imagined it. You imagined it. Get off this roof now. I grabbed my toolbox and hurried toward the ladder. But then I stopped short. He was there, standing at the base of the ladder. I froze. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. He hadn't climbed up. He hadn't jumped. He was just there, staring up at me with those empty, white eyes. Then his mouth opened. Not wide, just slightly. Just enough that I could see the darkness inside. No sound came out. No breath. No whisper. Nothing. Just that gaping, soundless mouth. I took a step back, gripping my toolbox like a weapon. Then the ladder shook. Violently. I watched in horror as it wobbled, metal legs scraping against the shingles. It swayed once, twice, then it tipped. It crashed down with a heavy clatter, disappearing into the overgrown weeds below. I was trapped. A cold wave of panic rolled through me. I scanned the rooftop, searching for another way down. The gutters? Too weak. The trellis? Too far. Jumping? A broken leg waiting to happen. My heart hammered against my ribs. The wind had picked up again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was voices. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. A chaotic, overlapping murmur that filled the air, threading through the howling wind. I couldn't make out the words. They weren't in English. They weren't in any language I recognized. They weren't even words at all, just shapes of speech, twisting, curling, clawing at the edges of my mind. The tiles under my feet shifted. I staggered, barely keeping my balance. It felt like the roof itself was moving, shifting beneath me like a living thing. I turned back toward the main section of the roof, and he was there, standing in the exact same spot as before. I didn't see him move. He never moved. But he was closer now. Much closer. My stomach turned ice cold. My brain screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then I noticed. His limbs. They were wrong. Slightly longer than before. His arms stretched a fraction too far past his waist. His legs were just a bit too thin, too elongated. As if he wasn't just a man. As if he had never been a man. I clenched my fists. I needed to look away, to find an escape, but I knew the second I did, he'd be closer. He never moved, but he was always closer, and I was running out of time. I tried not to blink. My eyes burned, my vision blurred at the edges, but I couldn't look away. Not now. Not when I knew what would happen if I did. The wind howled around me, the whispering voices weaving through the night air like unseen hands clawing at my mind. The shingles beneath my boots creaked, shifting just slightly, as if warning me that time was running out. Then, footsteps. Behind me. Slow. Deliberate. I swallowed hard. I couldn't turn around. I knew the second I did, the man would be closer. But my instincts screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something. Another step. And then, clear as day, the whispering changed. The words formed, as if they had always been there, waiting for me to understand. You see me now. My body locked up. I never left. My breath hitched. Come down. Something snapped inside me. I moved. I lunged for the only escape I had left, a narrow ledge leading to a lower section of the roof. It wasn't much, but if I could make it down, I might find another way off this damn house. I reached the ledge, gripping the edge with shaky hands, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The wind roared around me. The whispers became laughter, thin, distant, wrong. I swung my legs over, steadying myself. I just needed to climb down. Needed to. I blinked, and he was there, crouched above me, perched on the very edge of the rooftop. His head was tilted at an impossible angle, his neck bending so far to the side that it looked broken. His arms dangled loosely, fingers twitching, stretching toward me. His eyes, those horrible, empty eyes, bored into mine. I gasped, my grip slipping, and I fell. The impact knocked the air from my lungs. My head hit something hard. Wood, maybe, or metal. Stars exploded across my vision. Everything went blurry. My limbs felt heavy. My body wouldn't listen. I couldn't move. Through the haze, I saw him, crawling toward me. Not walking, crawling. His limbs bent at impossible angles, his fingers scrabbling against the tiles, his body moving in jerky, unnatural motions. His mouth finally moved. It stretched, widened, forming a gaping, unnatural grin. The whispers stopped. And then, darkness. I woke to voices, distant, muffled, fading in and out like I was underwater. Then pain, a dull, throbbing ache at the back of my skull. My limbs felt leaden, my skin clammy with cold sweat. I blinked hard, trying to focus. Above me, blurred shapes moved against the evening sky. Flashing red and blue lights danced at the edges of my vision. Hey, stay with us. A paramedic, a man in a dark uniform, his face lined with concern. Another figure knelt beside me, checking my vitals. I was on the ground, in the yard. The house loomed behind them, silent and still. The roof was high above, barely visible in the dim light. What? My voice came out cracked, barely a whisper. You took a nasty fall, the paramedic said. Neighbors saw you lying here, called it in. Can you tell me your name? I forced the words out. Michael. Reeves. The paramedic nodded. Good. You're lucky, Michael. No broken bones. But we're taking you in for a full checkup. Do you remember what happened? I opened my mouth, then stopped. I remembered. The whispers, the wind, the man on the roof. But I couldn't say it. Not to them. Instead, I forced myself to glance around. The ladder, I croaked. It fell. The paramedic frowned. No, it didn't. I stared at him. I turned my head, ignoring the sharp pain in my neck. And there it was, my ladder, standing exactly where I had left it, perfectly steady against the side of the house. Untouched. My stomach twisted. No, it fell. I saw it. The paramedic exchanged glances with his partner. You might have hit your head harder than we thought. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell them everything. But what would I even say? That I saw a man who wasn't there? That he followed me, moved without moving, and made the world twist around me? That I wasn't crazy? They wouldn't believe me. I barely believed myself. I barely registered being loaded into the ambulance. My mind was a fog, caught between reality and the memory of that rooftop. Somewhere along the ride, my hands fumbled for my phone, needing something, anything, to ground me. That's when I saw it. A new picture in my gallery. I didn't remember taking any pictures today. My heart pounded as I tapped it open. The image loaded. It was me, on the rooftop, taken from behind, and standing right behind me. So close I should have felt him, was the man. White, empty eyes, mouth slightly open, watching me. I nearly dropped the phone. Later that night, I lay in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. I hadn't spoken much since arriving. The doctors said I had a mild concussion, some bruising, nothing serious. They let me keep my phone. I didn't delete the photo. I should have, but I didn't. At some point, I turned my head toward the window. The glass reflected the city skyline, the dark outlines of buildings against the cloudy night sky. And on the rooftop of the hospital, standing at the very edge, a tall, thin figure, watching. The screen cuts to black. I should have turned back when I saw the sign. It stood at the village entrance, its wood so warped and rotted that the carved letters had faded into nothingness. The only hint that a name had once been there was the ghost of shallow indentations in the wood, as if even the memory of this place was trying to disappear. But I wasn't the kind of man who paid much attention to such things. I was here for a job, evaluate the land, take notes, and send my report. Nothing more. I parked my truck at the edge of the dirt road, stepping out into the crisp autumn air. Before me stretched the remains of a forgotten village, surrounded on all sides by dense forest. The trees pressed in thickly, their skeletal branches tangled overhead, as if they, too, were keeping a secret. The village itself was eerily untouched. Usually, abandoned places bore the scars of time and trespassers, shattered windows, graffiti, signs of squatters. But here, there was none of that. It was as if everyone had simply stood up one day and left, without a sound, without a struggle. A rusted bicycle leaned against a crumbling fence, its tires deflated and chain long since snapped. A dried-up well sat in the village square, its stones covered in moss, the rope frayed and dangling like a severed noose. Houses stood with doors slightly ajar, gaping open like silent mouths. And yet, despite its emptiness, something felt wrong. There was no birdsong, no rustling of leaves, no distant hum of insects. Just silence, thick and absolute. The only sound was my own boots crunching on the brittle ground. Even the wind had abandoned this place. I exhaled sharply, shaking off the unease. Superstition. That's all it was. The locals had warned me about this place, of course. Every town has its ghost stories. A village where people vanished overnight? A place where voices echoed back, even when you weren't speaking? It was nonsense. A mix of old rumors and overactive imaginations. Still, as I made my way deeper into the village square, I couldn't deny the heavy stillness pressing down on me. Then I saw the house. It stood at the far end of the square, its wooden frame sagging with decay. Unlike the others, its door wasn't just ajar, it was slightly open, just enough to see inside. A sliver of darkness beckoned. I hesitated, not because I was afraid, of course, but because there was something deliberate about that door. Like someone or something was expecting me. Shaking my head, I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the village sign, or what remained of it. Then, turning toward the house, I stepped onto the rotting porch. The boards groaned beneath my weight, and as I pushed open the door, the stale scent of dust and abandonment filled my nose. Inside, the house was frozen in time. A dining table sat in the center of the room, chairs neatly arranged, plates and silverware set as if waiting for a meal. Thick layers of dust coated everything, undisturbed, untouched. The air was stale, heavy with the weight of forgotten years. I lifted my phone to take another picture. The camera clicked, the screen capturing the eerie stillness of the room. But as I glanced at the image, my breath caught in my throat. In the reflection of the window, just behind me, stood a faint shadowy figure. I turned sharply, nothing. Just empty space. The silence around me deepened, thick and suffocating. I swallowed hard. Maybe the stories weren't just stories after all. I stepped out of the house, my pulse still unsteady. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, something unseen, just beyond the edge of my senses. I needed to focus. I was here for a job, and letting my nerves get the best of me wasn't an option. I inhaled deeply and pulled out my notebook, flipping to a fresh page. Mapping the village would help ground me, give me something tangible to hold on to. The layout was simple, a central square, with roads branching off in 4 directions. A church to the north, houses scattered along the east and west, and what looked like an old schoolhouse to the south. Beyond that, the forest pressed in close, as if trying to reclaim the land. I started walking down one of the roads leading east, making notes as I went. The houses here were in the same eerie state of preservation, doors slightly ajar, furniture still in place, as if the people had stepped out for a moment and never returned. The road curved slightly, then veered left. I followed it. A few minutes later, I stepped back into the village square. I frowned. That wasn't right. I had walked in a straight line. Shaking my head, I tried again, this time taking the road west. It twisted through the village, past houses that all looked the same, their hollow windows watching me. I walked longer this time, making sure I wasn't just imagining things. But when I emerged back into the square, my stomach turned. I checked my watch. I had been walking for nearly 15 minutes, but I had covered no real distance. I turned on my phone's GPS. No signal. The roads weren't leading out. They were looping. My mouth felt dry as I turned to the northern road, the one leading to the church. It had to go somewhere. It had to. I forced myself forward, my boots crunching over the brittle dirt. The trees loomed taller here, their bare branches stretching like skeletal fingers. Then, at the very edge of my vision, something moved. I froze. A shadow tall, thin, just at the corner of my eye. I turned my head sharply. Nothing. But I could feel it. I wasn't alone. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, scanning the space between the houses, the alleys, the doorways. The air felt thicker now, pressing against my skin. Then, in the shattered glass of a broken window, I saw them. Not just one. Many. Figures, dark and formless, standing in the reflection. Some at a distance, others unnervingly close. My breath hitched as I studied the glass more carefully. The reflection showed the village square behind me, my own image standing in the foreground. But something was wrong. There were too many reflections. In one of my reflections had no face. A chill rushed through my body, sharp as a blade. I spun around, but once again, there was nothing there. Just empty space and silence. I needed to leave. Forgetting my attempt to map the village, I made my way to the largest house near the square. The mayor's house, judging by its size and the more elaborate design of its facade. If there were answers to be found, they'd be here. I stepped inside. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed only by my movements. A heavy wooden desk sat against the far wall, covered in scattered papers. Some had rotted with time, the ink bleeding into unreadable smears. But one journal lay open. Its pages were crisp, untouched by time. I leaned in. The last entry read, "We shouldn't have stayed. The echoes have noticed us. Soon, we'll be among them." A sharp chill ran down my spine. I turned the page. The next sheet was covered in hastily scribbled names, dozens of them. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes reached the bottom of the list. There, written in the same frantic hand, was my name, David Holt. The ink was still wet. I stumbled away from the desk, my breath uneven. The ink was still wet. Something had written my name moments ago. I wiped my hands on my jeans, trying to shake the growing unease clawing its way into my mind. There had to be a rational explanation. Someone had been here recently. Maybe a drifter, a prankster, someone messing with me. But deep down, I knew better. I pulled out my phone, checking the time. 11:43 a.m. That couldn't be right. That was the exact time I had arrived. I checked my watch. 11:43 a.m. I frowned, tapping the screen, adjusting the dial. Nothing changed. The time hadn't moved. I had been in this village for at least an hour, maybe more, but according to my watch and phone, time had stopped. My stomach tightened. I switched to my GPS. Still no signal. No Wi-Fi, no service, just a black void where the map should be. The battery bar was full, exactly as it had been when I first arrived. None of it made sense. I exhaled, forcing myself to focus. I needed to retrace my steps, get my bearings. Maybe stress was getting to me. Maybe I had just lost track of time. I left the mayor's house and turned back toward the village square. My plan was simple: find the road I came in on, get in my truck, and leave. But as I walked, something was off. The buildings didn't look quite the same. A house that had been missing a roof now had one, intact but rotting. A rusted bicycle that had been leaning against a fence was gone. The dried-up well in the square seemed farther away, its moss-covered stones darker, wetter, as if it had been recently used. Had I taken a wrong turn? No. The village wasn't that big, but something was shifting, changing. I swallowed hard and kept moving. Then I saw them again. The figures. At first, they were just vague shapes, barely noticeable in the windows of houses. But as I walked, I realized they weren't just in the windows. They were in the doorways, in the alleys, standing just beyond the tree line, unmoving, watching. They were gray, featureless, like unfinished silhouettes of people. Their forms seemed to flicker slightly, as if they weren't entirely real. I took a step back. They didn't move. I turned away, heart hammering. Then, in my peripheral vision, I saw them shift. Closer. I spun around. They were still, silent, but they had moved. I walked faster now, refusing to run, refusing to give in to whatever was happening. The village was playing tricks on me, trying to break me down, but I wouldn't let it. I just had to get to my truck. I made it to the edge of the square, following the road where I had left my vehicle. Relief flooded my chest as I reached the spot, but my truck was gone. I stopped cold, my breath catching in my throat. No tire tracks, no sign that it had ever been there. Just an empty stretch of cracked earth. I turned around, scanning the village, my pulse racing. The road I had driven in on, it was gone. In its place was another row of houses. Some I recognized, others I didn't. The landscape had shifted again, warping like a living thing, rearranging itself while I wasn't looking. My throat went dry. I was trapped. A chill crawled up my spine as I felt something behind me. Not heard, not saw, felt. A presence. Close. Too close. I turned slowly. The figures were closer now, standing at the edge of the square. Dozens of them. Their featureless forms seemed more defined, more solid. They didn't move, but they were waiting. I wasn't supposed to leave. I was supposed to stay, just like the others before me, just like the echoes. I was running now. I didn't know where I was going. Every road led back to the square. Every landmark twisted and changed when I wasn't looking. But I had to move, had to do something before the figures closed in completely. Then I saw it. A house at the very edge of the village. Unlike the others, its door wasn't ajar. It was shut, sealed tight, as if whatever was inside had been locked away on purpose. But that didn't matter. It was the only place left to go. I bolted toward it, shoving the door open with my shoulder. The wood groaned in protest, but it gave way, and I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The silence swallowed me whole. I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door. My pulse pounded in my ears, sweat dripping down my neck. Outside, the village was deathly still, but I knew they were out there, waiting. I turned to take in my surroundings and froze. The house was familiar, not just in the way old places sometimes feel familiar, with their worn wooden floors and the scent of dust and time. This was something else. The furniture, the placement of the chairs, the worn-out rug, the cabinet in the corner, I had seen all of it before. My stomach twisted as my eyes landed on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. A framed photograph sat there, yellowed with age. Hands trembling, I stepped closer and lifted it. The glass was cracked, but the image was clear enough. A group of villagers standing together in front of the square. Men, women, children. Their expressions were neutral, their clothes decades out of date. And then I saw him. Saw me. I nearly dropped the frame. It wasn't just someone who looked like me. It was me. The same face, the same eyes. But the photo was old, at least 50, maybe 60 years. The edges curled with age, the ink slightly faded. This wasn't possible. It wasn't real. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind scrambled for explanations, for logic, but nothing made sense. Then I saw the mirror. It stood against the far wall, its glass foggy with dust. My reflection should have been there, should have been staring back at me. But the mirror was empty. A choked noise escaped my throat. I stepped closer, waving a hand, moving from side to side. Nothing. I wasn't there. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The village didn't allow outsiders. It took them, swallowed them whole. I had never been meant to leave. I was always meant to be here. A cold presence filled the room, pressing against my skin like frostbite. I turned, and my stomach dropped. The shadows were inside. They stood in the corners, by the walls, filling the space where the light should have been. Silent, featureless, no longer lingering at a distance. Waiting. I backed away, my body shaking. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, but my legs felt heavy. My arms, my hands numb. Something was happening to me. I looked down. My fingers were fading, turning translucent like mist in the morning sun. I let out a strangled gasp and stumbled toward the door. My legs buckled beneath me, and I crashed to the floor. My hands braced against the wood, but I couldn't feel it anymore. I was dissolving. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was gone. My body was slipping away, as if the village itself was unmaking me. In my fading vision, I saw the mirror again. Saw the last thing I would ever see. A new shadow standing among the others. My own. And then, nothing. The sky was overcast when Mark Whitaker pulled up to the entrance of the abandoned village. The trees loomed on either side of the narrow road, their bare branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. He sighed, rubbing his temples. This was supposed to be a routine check-in. David Holt, the original surveyor, had missed his last 2 scheduled calls. No emails, no updates, nothing. The company had sent Mark to find out what was going on. He stepped out of his car, his boots crunching against the gravel. And that's when he saw it. Another vehicle, parked just ahead. A black pickup truck. Driver's side door open. Keys still dangling in the ignition. Mark's stomach tightened. He pulled out his phone and dialed David's number. Straight to voicemail. He swallowed hard, glancing past the abandoned truck toward the village. It sat there, silent and empty, just as he'd been told. But something about it felt wrong, like it was waiting. Mark took a deep breath and moved forward. The entrance to the village was eerily still. No wind, no birds, no sound at all except for the dull thud of his own footsteps. He walked past houses with sagging roofs and darkened windows, their doors hanging open like yawning mouths. "David?" he called out. His voice felt swallowed by the silence. No answer. The village square came into view. A dried-up well, a few broken benches, and the mayor's house standing tall at the center. Mark hesitated. A strange, nagging sensation crawled at the back of his mind. He wasn't alone. He turned sharply, scanning the windows of the nearby houses. For a split second, he thought he saw something, a shape, just at the edge of his vision. He shook his head, exhaling sharply. "Get a grip, man." Fishing his phone from his pocket, he opened the camera app. If David had been here, maybe a few pictures would help piece together what happened. He lifted the phone, framing a shot of the square. And then, his breath caught in his throat. In the phone's preview, just over his shoulder, stood a shadow. Tall, featureless, watching. His fingers went numb, nearly dropping the device. His heart pounded as he spun around. Nothing. Just empty space. But the cold was there now, pressing against him, wrapping around him like unseen hands. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. His gut screamed at him to turn around, to run. But he couldn't, because behind him, just barely audible in the thick silence, a voice whispered, "Welcome home." I moved into the apartment on a Sunday afternoon, hauling boxes up 3 flights of stairs and cursing my decision to save money by refusing professional movers. The place was small but comfortable, 1 bedroom, a modest kitchen, and a living room with an old brick fireplace that gave it character. The floors were wooden, worn down by decades of footsteps, and they groaned under my weight no matter how carefully I stepped. It wasn't much, but after the breakup, I needed a fresh start. A place of my own, somewhere quiet. The building itself was old, one of those early 1900s constructions with high ceilings and ornate moldings. The landlord, a thin man with an unshakable cigarette habit, assured me it was well maintained. "Solid structure," he had said, tapping a wall with his knuckles. "You'll hear some creaks at night, but that's just the wood settling." I didn't mind that. What I did mind was the way my new neighbors acted. The few I met, an elderly woman from 2 doors down, a young couple from across the hall, seemed polite but distant. When I asked about the history of the building, they either changed the subject or gave vague, dismissive answers. I should have noticed the hesitation. I should have questioned why no one ever spoke about the basement. The first night was uneventful, aside from the usual discomfort of sleeping in a new place. The mattress felt unfamiliar, the air slightly musty. I told myself it was just the old building's scent, something I would get used to. But the silence, it was different. In the city, you expect a background hum. Cars in the distance, the occasional siren, muffled conversations from the next apartment. Here, after dark, there was nothing. No voices, no music, just the soft creaking of the floors when I moved and the faint sound of my own breathing. Then, on the second night, I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it. A slow, rhythmic thump. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to place it. It wasn't the pipes. The heating system was off. It wasn't the wind. There was no draft. The sound wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. It was coming from below. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stepped onto the cold wooden floor. The sound remained steady, like the slow beating of a drum. Or a heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. I crouched down, pressing my palm against the floorboards. I could feel the vibrations, faint but deliberate. It wasn't random, like the shifting of old wood. It was steady, almost alive. I told myself it was just the old pipes expanding. That's what rational people believe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was underneath me. The sound didn't go away. Each night, around 3 in the morning, I would wake up to that slow, rhythmic thumping. At first, it was distant, muffled. But as the nights passed, it grew louder. And worse, closer. I started to notice something unsettling. When I lay in bed, listening, the sound seemed to match the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I tested it, held my breath, slowed it down, quickened it, and each time, the thumping adjusted as if something beneath the floor was listening. I wasn't the kind of person who jumped to supernatural conclusions. I prided myself on being logical, rational, but logic didn't explain why the sound felt almost responsive. By the fourth night, I decided to ask my neighbor. Mrs. Callahan lived 2 doors down. I had seen her a few times, always wearing the same gray cardigan, her wispy hair pulled back tight. She reminded me of the type of grandmother who always had hard candies in her purse, but something about her was off. The way she avoided looking at me in the hallway, the way she walked faster when she passed my door. I knocked, waited. After a long pause, she opened it just a crack, her wrinkled face barely visible. "Yes. Sorry to bother you," I said, keeping my voice light. "I was just wondering, have you ever heard strange noises at night?" Her fingers tightened on the doorframe. "What kind of noises?" "A thumping sound, like something under the floorboards." Her face lost color. She glanced behind her, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then, without another word, she shut the door. That was the moment I knew. Something was wrong with this building, and everyone knew it but me. I started exploring during the day, looking for anything that could explain the noise. That's when I found the door. It was at the end of the hallway, past the stairwell. At first glance, it looked like a maintenance closet, but the handle was old brass, worn smooth from years of use. And it was locked. Not just locked, secured. A thick metal chain wrapped around the handle, held in place by a heavy padlock. No sign, no explanation, just a locked door leading down. When I asked the landlord, he barely looked up from his cigarette. "Basement's off limits." "Why?" He exhaled a cloud of smoke, eyes distant. "There was an accident. Years ago, before my time." "What kind of accident?" "Let it go," he said, stubbing the cigarette out. "You got no reason to be down there." That should have been enough. But it wasn't. That night, the sound changed. The heartbeat was still there, steady, rhythmic. But now, there was something else. A whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was soft, like someone speaking just below the surface of the floor. It came in waves, mixing with the thump-thump-thump. Not in English, not in any language I recognized. And it was right beneath me. I sat up in bed, pulse hammering. The sound was coming from under the floor, directly below me. I dropped to my knees, pressing my ear against the cold wood. The whispering stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a slow, deliberate exhale, like something was breathing. I shot back up, heart pounding. I didn't sleep that night, because now, I wasn't just hearing it. I could feel it. I lasted one more night. One more night of lying awake, listening to the heartbeat beneath my floor. One more night of whispering that faded the moment I tried to focus on it. One more night of feeling something, waiting. That morning, I made up my mind. I was going to the basement. The landlord's office was on the first floor, a cramped space filled with filing cabinets and the stale smell of cigarette smoke. The desk was cluttered, papers, receipts, an old coffee mug stained dark from years of neglect. And behind it, hanging on a small nail, was a single iron key. I didn't hesitate. The hallway was empty as I made my way back to the locked basement door. The key fit perfectly, and as I turned it, I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like something knew what I was about to do. The chain rattled as I unwound it from the handle. I pushed the door open, and the air changed. The temperature dropped instantly, not like stepping into a cool room, but a biting, unnatural cold that settled into my bones. The air was thick, damp, heavy with the scent of earth, and beneath it all was something else, a rot that clung to the back of my throat. I stepped inside. The basement was massive. The ceiling was low, supported by thick wooden beams. The walls were old brick, crumbling in places, damp with condensation. Pipes ran along the ceiling, rusted and hissing with trapped air. And the sound, the heartbeat, it was deafening down here. No longer a faint thump beneath the floor, but a full-bodied, chest-rattling pulse. It came from deeper inside, beyond the flickering overhead bulb that barely lit the space. I moved forward, my footsteps echoing off the cold concrete. As I passed one of the walls, I froze. There were scratches, deep, uneven gouges carved into the brick, like someone had dragged their nails against the stone until their fingers broke. Some were long, desperate. Others, short, frantic, like whoever made them had been trapped. My stomach tightened. I wasn't alone down here. The sound pulled me forward, past old storage shelves, past rusted pipes that dripped onto the floor. At the far end of the basement, tucked into the corner, was something out of place. A wooden trapdoor. It was old, much older than the building itself. The wood was dark, warped with age, the edges sealed shut with thick, rusted nails. As soon as I touched it, the heartbeat stopped. Everything stopped. The silence was suffocating. A total, absolute stillness that made my skin crawl. It was as if the entire building had inhaled and was waiting. I swallowed hard, forcing down the fear clawing up my throat. And then, I pried the first nail loose. Then another, and another. As I worked, something changed in the air. The silence wasn't just an absence of noise. It felt aware, watching. The last nail came free. I hesitated. Then, gripping the edge of the trapdoor, I pulled. The wood groaned as it lifted, revealing nothing but a gaping black hole. The air that rose from it was wrong, damp, stale, tinged with something foul. At first, I saw nothing. Just an empty void leading somewhere deep beneath the basement. Then, something shifted. A shape curled in the darkness. My breath caught. The figure twitched. And then, too pale, what hands gripped the edge of the hole. A soundless scream tore through my mind as the thing pulled itself from the hole. It moved with a sickening, unnatural grace, its body unfolding in slow, jerking motions, joints popping as it stretched upward. Its skin was stretched thin over a skeletal frame, its ribs visible beneath gray, clammy flesh. But the worst part was its chest. Where a human heart should be, there was something else. A pulsing, swollen cavity that expanded and contracted with every beat. The same beat I had been hearing beneath my floor. The same rhythm that had invaded my sleep for days. Thump, thump, thump. The figure loomed over the hole, its arms too long, its fingers dragging against the cold concrete floor. It had no lips, only a gaping maw of exposed teeth, but I heard its voice. Not with my ears. In my head. You heard me. My stomach clenched. You came. The words slithered through my skull like an infection, burrowing deep into my thoughts. The voice was layered, distorted, as if spoken by many mouths at once. It wasn't asking. It was stating a fact. I had come, and now I couldn't leave. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I turned, stumbling backward, my feet slipping against the damp floor. My only thought was get out. Run. Escape. The thing moved faster than anything that size should have been able to. One moment it was crouched by the trapdoor. The next, it was standing between me and the exit, its form flickering like a glitch in reality. Its head cocked to the side, and the whispering in my head grew louder. Not words anymore. A chant. A rhythmic, droning hum that rose and fell in perfect time with the heartbeat. The pressure in my skull grew unbearable. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the sound wasn't external, it was inside me, rattling my bones, sinking into my lungs. The basement door slammed shut. I was trapped. Panic clawed at my throat as I stumbled back, knocking over a rusted metal shelf. My eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help me. That's when I saw it. An old, decayed leather journal, half buried in dust. I grabbed it with shaking hands and flipped it open. The pages were brittle, faded, but the words, scribbled in frantic, uneven handwriting, sent ice down my spine. I hear it. Every night, I hear it. They buried him alive. He won't stop. He won't stop until someone listens. A chill ran through me as I read the last page. The ink was smeared, but the words were still legible. The others, they heard it too. They're gone now, and I will be next. The name signed at the bottom was unfamiliar, but the last entry was dated over 40 years ago. I looked up, my breath shallow. The figure hadn't moved, but its chest cavity pulsed, faster now. Urgent. He was the first, the voice whispered in my head. The first tenant, the first to hear the heartbeat, the first to disappear. And I was next. The thing stepped forward. I felt my body locking up, my muscles seizing as the whispering grew deafening. It reached out, long fingers stretching toward me. My skin crawled. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then, a thought. The heartbeat. The voice. They only had power if I listened. I forced my hands up to my ears, pressing hard. The whispering wavered. The figure flickered, its form distorting like a bad signal. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to disappear. The thing let out a soundless scream. The heartbeat stuttered, its rhythm breaking apart. I felt something shift in the air, a sudden vacuum, like the world itself was holding its breath. My gaze dropped to the journal in my hands. I knew what I had to do. With one last breath, I threw the journal into the hole. The second it hit the darkness, the thing lurched. It twisted, its body contorting as if being pulled back. Its fingers scrabbled against the floor, clawing at the concrete as an invisible force dragged it down. And then, the trapdoor slammed shut. The heartbeat stopped. The silence was immediate, suffocating. My own ragged breaths were the only sound in the basement. Then, slowly, the air changed. The pressure lifted. The damp rot in the air faded. I staggered backward, staring at the closed trapdoor, half expecting it to burst open again. But it didn't. It was over. I didn't question it. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I turned and ran, up the stairs, out of the basement, out of the building. I never went back. I woke up in my apartment. For a long moment, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my body too heavy to move. My mind reeled, trying to process what had happened. Had I really gone into the basement? Had I really seen that thing? It felt distant now, like a fever dream slipping through my fingers. But the fear, the dread, still clung to me, thick and suffocating. I sat up, glancing around. My apartment looked the same. The same creaky wooden floors. The same dim lighting. The same eerie silence that had greeted me on my first night here. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood. My legs ached, my body sore as if I'd run for miles. My throat was dry, raw. I needed to see something. Anything to prove it had really happened. I grabbed my keys and stepped out into the hall. The building was silent, as always. The air stale, unmoving. I walked down the corridor, my breath quickening as I reached the basement door. Locked. A thick, rusted chain wound tightly around the handle, a heavy padlock securing it in place. Just like before, as if I had never touched it. I backed away, my skin crawling. I needed to leave. Now, I started throwing my things into a suitcase. Clothes, laptop, toothbrush, I didn't care about packing neatly. I just needed out. As I shoved the last of my things into my bag, something caught my eye. Something under my bed. A small shape. I hesitated, my breath shallow, before slowly crouching down. It was tiny, barely the size of a pebble. But as I reached for it, I saw the truth. A fingernail. Yellowed. Chipped. The edge caked with dried blood. My stomach twisted. The air around me suddenly felt thick again, the silence too loud. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I forced myself to move, to get up, to run. And then, I heard it. Soft. Subtle. Almost gentle. A slow, rhythmic thump. Coming from beneath the floor. Thump. 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 The heartbeat had started again.
And so, dear listeners, we reach the end, or perhaps just another beginning. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the shadows, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which story haunted you the most. But before you go, remember, the dark is never truly empty.